Activists, artists, and citizens from nearly all walks of life and perspectives have struggled to reach beyond the limits of mainstream media. Whether it's Fox News or the New York Times, Rush Limbaugh, or Brian Williams, many people say they are tired of being talked to or overlooked. They seek to exercise their own rights to free speech, to fulfill a need to hear from independent voices. They exercise their rights and fulfill their needs by creating new avenues for speech, by inventing new forms of communication, and by seizing the microphone to speak to their community. This movement did not begin and does not end with the internet or social media. It is a movement as old as the dawn of mass media itself. This series will highlight the contributions of alternative media in a political environment that seems to reward those with the most money, a political environment that does not necessarily reward those with the best ideas or those who serve the critical information needs of their communities. We're looking beyond mainstream media.
Low-power television service was established by the FCC in 1982. Since that time, it has provided unique and important opportunities for locally owned television service in small communities, both rural communities and smaller communities within large urban markets. In many cases, low-power stations may be the only television station in an area providing local news, weather, and public affairs programming. Also, many low-power stations air niche programming to residents of a specific ethnic, racial, and religious community within the larger area. Low-power service has also significantly increased the diversity of broadcast station ownership. Stations are operated by such entities as schools, religious organizations, local governments, community groups, and a wide variety of small businesses. In addition, low power has created abundant opportunities for new entry into television broadcasting by providing first-time ownership opportunities for minorities and women. These low-power TV stations deserve protection in a way that's closely comparable to the larger entities. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
My name is Mark Lloyd. I'm the director of the Media Policy Initiative here at the New America Foundation. And we're calling this program Disappearing Off the Dial, the Future of Low-Power Television. And as Claire McCaskill suggested, this is an important service that oftentimes is not particularly well understood by most Americans. We watch TV and we don't know if it's low power or full power or half power. We're going to talk about low-power television and why it's important and what's happening with it now. And we have a couple of folks who are expert at helping us with this. Next to me is Tara Ballesteros. I'm pronouncing that correctly. I just want to be sure, as the communications director for ZGS Communications, a Hispanic-owned multimedia company headquartered in Arlington, Virginia. ZGS owns and operates 13 Spanish-language television stations, representing the largest group of independent stations affiliated with the Telemundo television network. In addition, ZGS owns 3 Spanish-language radio stations serving the D.C. area and Tampa, and a Spanish-language web portal, Hola Ciudad. HolaCiudad.com, and Ms. Ballesteros is the ZGS liaison to Congress and the FCC, working to expand opportunities and to promote localism and diversity in the broadcast industry. Formerly served as the Director of Education Programs at the Hispanic Scholarship Fund Institute. Thank you. And Peter Tannenwald. Peter Tannenwald is a veteran communications attorney with the law firm of Fletcher, Held, and Hildreth. In addition to representing a broad range of radio and television broadcast station groups and individual station owners, Mr. Tannenwald counsels common carrier and wireless clients in both regulatory and transactional matters and represents investors and developers in new technologies. So thank you both for joining us. So let me start with you, Peter. Low power television. Why was it started, and what is the real difference, at least at the FCC, between low-power television and full-power television?
It was started for really 4 reasons. I think one of the driving forces was to allow small businesses to have an entry into the broadcasting business. And that economic model is an outlet for not only small businesses to provide broadcast programming, but small businesses to have an affordable advertising vehicle over the airwaves. It also had the minority and female ownership aspect that you considered, and it was also an entry, or is an entry-level place for people who want to start careers in broadcasting. I think the FCC was interested in it for those reasons, but also because it creates a lot of spectrum efficiency, or more spectrum efficiency than they had before. Mm-hmm. Television stations that are at high power levels have to be a certain number of miles apart. You can put low power stations sometimes in between where you can't fit a full power station. So it brings service to small communities, small businesses, and it makes more efficient use of the spectrum.
And how long have you been working on issues related to low-power TV?
When they created low-power TV in 1982, I sat down with a radio client from Lake Havasu City, Arizona, and we spent an evening creating a low-power TV application, which we filed and was granted. And Channel 45 was built in that community, which is a vacation community for Arizona and California, and it's on the air today.
Wow, wow. In 1982?
Right, I think
Yeah.
it went on in 83 or 84 is when
Wow.
it was finally built and
Yeah.
flipped the switch. Lee doesn't own it anymore, somebody else does, but it's there.
So, and Tara, how long have you been involved?
So I've been with ZGS for a little bit over 8 years.
Wow.
And working on this issue since my first day in the office, which was probably to connect with Peter on behalf of our company and work. Our company started 30 years ago with $200 and a rented video camera, producing Spanish language programming. And it has since grown into what it is today. And ZGS feels very strongly that the low power Class A LPTV industry is what gave it the opportunities that it has, which is expanded into owning full power stations as well.
Now we have a little bit of video which sort of shows, doesn't tell, but shows some of the sort of services that the local low power. Could you talk a little bit about what sort of services
Sure.
the local low power TV?
So we own the local Telemundo affiliate here in DC. It's a Class A LPTV. All of our stations are promotionally driven and super community oriented. We have local news and community affairs programming at all of our stations. So we really cater to the communities where we're in which we serve. We're in a different markets. So here, maybe it's very Salvadoran. It's South American. We're starting to see more Mexicans, more Caribbeans. But in a market like Hartford, it's almost exclusively Caribbean. So we do a lot of different things to serve our community. We have events. We have one here called La Feria de la Familia. It's a grassroots family event, free, where we bring in different organizations, partners. So really, we are there to service our community, whether it's through programming and/or events and promotions. We think of ourselves oftentimes as the first line of contact, sometimes for newly arrived or people who, Spanish language viewers tend to get a lot of their information, or Spanish language speakers get a lot of their information via television. So we take that responsibility very seriously.
So one of the things that was interesting, and you sort of suggested this, is we often think of the Hispanic market as being this one block, but you described a wide variety of different communities.
It's very different depending on, and I think you see that with the Spanish language players in the market. Everyone's trying, there's a very Mexican audience that we're serving, but we're also trying to figure out how to reach, the non-Mexican Hispanic, which is the fastest growing. And so it really depends on where you are, and everybody tries different things. Soccer obviously is a big one to attract. So with the different programming, whether it's sports, novellas obviously are key to any Spanish language broadcast. And then local news is super, super important for us.
So we have an audio clip here which talks a little bit about the importance of Telemundo as a service. To some extent, this seems directed at advertisers. So let's take a listen to this.
Our viewers live in two worlds. They are American too. Their lives forever changed here in the U.S. And English language television has become part of their lives. But a heartfelt bond ties our viewers to Spanish language television.
¿Qué pasa? ¿Por qué se callan?
The connection is emotional,
No puedo creer que estés aquí.
cultural, personal.
No se los voy a permitir, ¿me oyeron?
It's a familiar and deep connection to home. This is the duality of our Hispanic identity.
¡Es mi hija, devuélvemela!
Like our viewers, we combine the best of two worlds. Telemundo brings them the highest quality Spanish language content that respects their traditions and embraces their new reality. Modern, yet traditional. Bold, but familiar. Sexy, but respectful. The new Telemundo is all about what it means to be a U.S. Hispanic today. Bright, colorful, bold, impassioned, alive, and vibrant. The power of the T equals the power of our view.
Now, Peter, let me ask you: does this suggests that the goals for low-power television back in the early 1980s have, to some extent, been realized? Would you say that's a fair characteristic?
I think that's correct. There are more low power stations than full power stations today. They represent, I would say, more than 90% of the ethnic programming services in the country. They are available in small communities, 100,000 and less, that can't support a full power station. They're affordable, and they are entry level for careers. I think it's met all of the needs.
So why do I have the impression, perhaps I'm giving the impression, that somehow low-power television, despite these successes, is having some challenge?
Well, they have challenges because the regulatory structure has proceeded and has left them out at many stages. When we tried to get must-carry on cable for them, it didn't do very well in Congress. The lobbying was pretty strong against it, and so it was limited to below the top 160 markets. When we wanted to get Class A television for permanent spectrum, it was cut off in 1999 and new people couldn't get in the door. The cable companies for a long time cried channel scarcity. They couldn't carry us voluntarily, but in today's digital world they still don't want to carry us. We're competitors for selling local advertising. The digital transition came along and the FCC put a freeze on Class A applications and made a lot of low power stations change channels, and of course nobody paid the cost of that except the low power stations. So no matter which way you turn, there's either a regulatory obstacle, a large industry obstacle like cable, or expenses being put on you like being forced to change channels frequently. Those are tough burdens for small businesses.
So let me make sure that I understand this correctly. We have a service where new entrants have been allowed to come in more easily than they've been allowed with services like full power television. We have a service that now provides direct service to communities that have otherwise been overlooked by many full power broadcast operations, sometimes in language. But somehow this does not seem to be valued by the politicians in Washington or the regulators in Washington. What's going on here with this? How is it that such clearly a valuable service has been left behind?
I think there are a couple of reasons. First of all, you have a group of people in Washington who think that spectrum for television programming is all wasted and that it should all be on alternative delivery mechanisms, even though we may have to pay for those. And keep in mind that a lot of this ethnic programming is on extra cost tiers on cable. It's not that it isn't available, it just costs a lot of money. That's part of it. I think there is a certain amount of resentment maybe at the FCC that a lot of these stations got in the way of the full power digital transition when you had to give every full power station 2 channels. They wiped out a lot of low powers, but they couldn't wipe out the Class A's, and it was an annoyance. And then in the end, I think the bottom line is the reluctance of the low power industry to come to Washington and make its case. They don't want to spend the money, or they're afraid. They chat among themselves on the internet. And while I don't like to be critical of an industry I do a lot of work for, I think there is a contrast with the low power FM industry that had the Prometheus group here every day pounding the pavement, and they're now the little favored people, whereas the low power people who stayed around the country working to get their television service on the air missed the boat to a large extent because they didn't make their presence known here.
Now Tara, I know part of your work is actually to lobby, to liaison with members of Congress. And you've been doing this for a while. Is it your sense that members of Congress and folks at the FCC really do not appreciate service to the Latino audience?
I'm not sure I would say they don't appreciate service to the Latino audience. You know, I think in all the meetings that we've had on the Hill and all the meetings that we have with FCC, you know, I think both do really realize the service that it provides. I'm not sure they're able to, or from what we've seen so far, come up with a solution to save this service or to make this service flourish. I mean, as you mentioned, with the diversity of ownership, entry into the industry, the communities that it serves, you know, and I think all of us in the low power industry have volunteered to be part of the solution. I think many of us just, especially, you know, those of us that are interested in staying in broadcasting, we just want to be able to compete. We want to play fairly. And we're pretty confident that if we are given permanency or if we're given access to the distribution systems, that many of our stations do and are able to compete with the full powers, with the, you know, we're all serving different audiences, but we feel very strongly that our programming, you know, we do a lot of community-based programming, a lot of local programming, and there are full powers that don't have any type of a public service obligation that the Class A stations have. And you know, my experience has been that many LPTV operators and LPTV stations who may not have Class A status, who missed the window, or for whatever reason, there are a lot of LPTVs that meet that obligation, the same one that Class A's. And so I think, you know, unless we put our heads together and figure out a way to make this, to continue this service, it's going to be, you know, it's a shame because we are serving, whether it's urban, rural, ethnic, foreign language, religious, and something that you said at the beginning that really we have to remind ourselves, those of us in the industry, our audience doesn't know whether they're watching full power, low power, or Class A. I mean, they turn on their TV set and they watch what they want to watch. And so if their LPTV is Spanish language or religious and it goes off the air, I mean, I think there's going to be some pretty, you know, disappointed viewers. I would also say, you know, to Peter's comment about the LPTV industry, you know, I think my company is fortunate in the sense that we have the backing of one of the major Spanish language networks in terms of the program we provide. But there are a lot of, you know, small business men and women who own LPTVs, and they don't have a large station group. They may have one, two, just a couple of stations. And so I think that makes it more challenging to organize and to speak and to share all the successes. Because if you travel around the country and, you know, several people have looked at it, there are a lot of really compelling stories, whether it's, you know, news from the State House or football on Friday nights, whatever it is. There's a lot of good programming that comes out of LPTVs and Class A's.
So someone who might rely, say, on market considerations when they think about what it is that the government should do or should not do, might say, if low power television is providing such valuable services and if you're doing well and you've got a growing audience base, then, you know, why can't you just compete in the market? Why do you need the government to to do anything. What would you say to that? Why can't LPTV, if you're providing a valuable service, just compete and win and be fine?
I think that when you're competing for a valuable resource,
Like Spectrum.
and your audience is, say, 10% of what a full power station's audience is, you're asking the regulators to make a value judgment that your content is important to preserve. I think there's an argument for doing that, notwithstanding the reluctance that many of us have for the government to make any decision about the value of content. But I think they're also reluctant to get into it, and we're up against a very strong driving force for spectrum for broadband. And if you combine that driving force with all the money and political power that is behind it against little guys, and you overlay on that some people who think that we shouldn't use spectrum for television at all, you got a rough road.
So one of the things that you are suggesting is that right now there is a tension between the national goals to have essentially wireless internet service, robust, high-speed wireless internet service, and the existence of this service that has been opened up to provide opportunities for entrepreneurs who don't have opportunities in full power, and to provide service to audiences that have been underserved. Why would there necessarily be the tension between those two things? Like, why can't you say, well, let's provide low power television an opportunity to bloom and thrive, and if we're going to impose any extra penalties or extra challenges, that we'll impose those challenges on the incumbent big players. So why not that? Why the tension between the little guys and the future? That's what it seems to be.
Well, I think there's always been tensions between the little guys and the future. I think that if you put enough value on these diverse services, the first thing you have to do is to get away from the conclusion that why don't they all become websites? And when we give all the wireless to everybody's tablets, you can watch them on those websites. Well, the country's not ready to shut down television yet. Television is still broadcasting a common experience to viewers in the community. They can talk about the programs the next day, share ideas. We're not ready to get rid of broadcasting yet, if we ever are. But there are some things that you could do if you wanted to preserve the opportunities that low-power TV offers. Just one off the top of my head is to allow them to participate in the broadband revolution. If you unlocked low-power TV stations from the ATSC television standard that we're using today, they could provide broadcasting and other types of data, including individually requested data, which is what broadband is about, in small communities within a year or 2 years. But the regulators don't want to do that because, well, there are different people who have different views, but I would say the predominant view is the government wants auction revenue and this wouldn't provide any.
So Tara, you were going to jump in there.
Well, I mean, one of the challenges that I see, or the challenges I see it, is, you know, LPTV is classified as a secondary service for whatever reason at the FCC. It is the low-hanging fruit. So it's the easy target when you're looking at a national initiative to reclaim spectrum and to have this broadband plan. And so for that reason, you know, I think we're looking at, okay, it's a secondary service, let's get rid of these guys, or let's move these guys, or figure out a way. I mean, I don't think that we're, like I said, we've all volunteered to be part of the solution and to figure out whether it's through channel sharing, whether it's with new technologies, trying, you know, bottom line is we want to stay in business, we want to continue to serve our audiences. So that's what I think our industry is trying to do, and we're trying to offer up solutions. Again, in order to do this based on regulatory things, we're going to have to think outside the box, and I don't know if we're ready to do that.
So Peter, you are.
Well, I'm thinking, low power TV is a secondary service, but it was made a secondary service by a decision of the FCC. And if it became good enough, as many of us think it did, there was no reason why the FCC couldn't make at least some of the stations primary. By making them secondary, it's a way of saying, when we want to do things in the future, you won't be in our way. But you can't do that when something gets valuable enough. We had to go to Congress to get Class A passed. The FCC wouldn't do it. So, and we didn't get enough out of Congress. We got one opportunity. But the idea that it's secondary doesn't do much for me, because you should be able to advance your status if you prove your worth.
And for the viewer at home, the notion that it's a secondary service is meaningless. This is a service that they're relying on and depending on. They don't, whatever.
It's a primary service for many people.
So if you could talk for a minute about the importance of cable and some of the challenges that LPTV has faced with regard to its relationship with cable.
Well, cable is important because, cable and satellite, because, whatever percentage you'd like to pick, 85% of a country watches television over a wired system, and a lot of young people don't even know there's another way to do it. So that's, you lose an important part of the audience if you are not on that distribution system. Cable companies don't like the idea of carrying low-power TV for a large number of reasons. They certainly don't want the government to tell them what they have to do. So that if the government were to tell them, that just gets their back up. Low-power TV sells advertising at lower rates than full power and is a bigger competitor to cable's local sales. Some low-power TVs are lousy, and they don't want them on because it's not good service. So if you start to ask them, well, carry the good ones, now you're asking them to make a content judgment, and it's easier for them to say, why don't we just drop all of it? I don't like that result, but I think all of those are factors.
So, Tara.
I mean, I would echo everything that Peter says on that. The challenge is that, we're going in from a disadvantage to access all the distribution systems. In some of the markets, depending on capacity, we've been fortunate enough to get onto some of the satellite systems. We're carried on all of the cable systems, but there, again, we go back to the permanency. There is no permanency, which makes it very difficult to operate a business and to grow and expand. If you don't know, that within 30 days, a cable company can pull out and say, okay, we don't want your channel anymore. That's a hard way to access capital. It's a very challenging business plan. So, like Peter, there's a lot of different reasons, I think, that the cable operators and satellite will tell us, capacity being the biggest one, but I think now it's gone, and with the programming, we have very valuable programming, and there's a lot of LPTVs where the programming, I think, is more valuable than some of the full powers.
Now, if you had a very influential, I won't say wealthy, but let's just say very influential member of the public, in front of maybe the chairperson at the Federal Communications Commission or an important member of Congress with oversight, what would you want that member of the public to understand and to do and to say to their elected officials?
That the low-power TV industry is an important outlet for ideas and cultural material that is not going to get on full-power television. And if you want a diverse country, a democratic country, a country that shares ideas and that grows in diversity, you must have an outlet for these ideas.
It's an outlet that supports diversity. It caters to the communities that it serves. It's not a network or a station that comes in and broadcasts the same thing to everyone. We work really hard to provide relevant programming and content to the audiences that we serve, and if these local voices disappear, I think that's a real challenge, and it's a real shame for this country to have these voices disappear.
So we have a few folks here who've actually come in, and maybe we have some questions from the audience. And Nick, I think, has agreed to help. So if you would raise your hands, and Nick will come to you and give you the microphone. So that we can.
Thank you all very much. You did a great job. My name is Greg Herman. I've been a low-power television broadcaster for 23 years.
Uh-huh.
And I can tell you that when we started, maybe 10%, 15% of people were MVPD or cable access. Now, essentially, it's inverted, 85, 90%. When you talked about, and I want to just say that has destroyed my business. We haven't been able to keep pace with the changes because we've had a boot on our neck, essentially. And I'm very proud of all the innovation, all the foreign language programming that I brought to the community before anyone else. So low power television is an unrivaled success in terms of diversity. But you mentioned something that I'd like you to elaborate on, in either Tara or Peter. When you say we're secondary, what are we secondary to? That's not everything, is it? And that's my question. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
I brought up the word secondary. That's how it's defined at the FCC, and that's where I think the block is. I absolutely do not think that we're secondary. And I think as you mention all the innovations, again, Peter probably can speak better to this issue, but I think this was set up, like you said, so long ago, and things changed so fast. But the regulations, the laws didn't change with it. And I think that's the real roadblock.
Well, I've certainly done some legal research on this issue. If you go back through the history of the FCC's decisions, reports and orders and so on, and the conditions that they have written on construction permits for low power stations, it says they are secondary to full power television. And that's it. So if you need room for a full power television station, a low power station has to get out of the way. The idea that it's secondary to anything at all, including a complete change of the spectrum and a reallocation to wireless, is an arguable legal point where I think we have some strength, but there are arguments on both sides of that.
Please.
Quick question on that very point, Peter. Mike Ravino, Low Power Spectrum Rights Coalition. It says in the act that when the auction happens, the low power is not involved. There's nothing, unless if you have a channel above the band plan that they're going for in your market, you're going to get cleared no matter what. All low power stations within the national 120 megahertz targeted band plan are going to move. All translators in there are going to move, unless they happen to be in the lower tier below where the auction happens, and no full power or Class A comes in and takes them. Then we have two low powers competing. Then we have the low powers that survive the repack, and the ones that are left outside of the TV study software because nothing they're not part of the auction software. But how do the ones that are, we're secondary, but we're bound to this huge multi-year administrative process to kick us out. They could eliminate us, but it would still take 3 to 5 years to get rid of us just in the normal course of processing.
And what is it? What's the question? I mean, is that?
So we don't know a lot of these variables, other than that maybe that we know we're going to be around just because of the sheer, largeness of 6,400 translators and
right
and whatnot.
Since we don't know whether the FCC is going to change Bulletin OET 69. We don't know if they're going to change any of the interference rules for low-power TV stations. We don't know if they're going to repack full-power TV stations at a co-location, in a co-location situation where every channel is filled, or whether there will be any in between. So it's almost impossible to predict what will remain available for low power. What seems to be self-evident to those of us who aren't computer geeks with the engineering software is if you started the low-power TV industry with 70 television channels, and you end up with 30 television channels, it seems like it's going to be harder to fit the low-power TV stations in there just by simple logic. But if they allowed the low-power stations to change their technology and provide a hybrid broadband broadcast service with OFDM and things like that, you actually could fit more of them in.
So Michael, did you?
So I guess along that line of thinking, so I guess I would ask Peter or both of you. So is your fear limited to, or the fear of the LPTV industry limited to that scenario, simply that in a kind of a musical, TV musical chairs, that when the music stops after the repack, there won't be enough channel slots? And, is that sort of the limit of it? In other words, that on a market-by-market basis, there may not be enough slots for all the existing LPTVs. And then if that's, and there may be a bigger problem than that, like maybe the commission doesn't even want to try to fit them in, I don't know. But assuming so, then I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about then some strategies. So for example, Peter, you've filed comments suggesting that LPTVs could share channels. So how much channel sharing should occur in order to fit, because there's these broadcasters, and if you look at the 4 in DC, for example, the 4 LPTVs, I think each of them are single stream. So a single stream over the air is 1 to 2 megahertz, and you can certainly easily fit 2. In fact, the government will be paying the full power guys to fit 2 stations on a channel. So to what degree is channel sharing a solution? And alternatively, what about giving preference to the LPTV stations that will continue to broadcast diversity of content? In other words, what you were talking about, the voices and providing the diversity, like minority language channels and so on. Should they have, in the repack, preference over secondary stations that perhaps are going to be converted to another purpose, or that are only construction permits and not actually broadcasting?
Michael, could you fully introduce yourself? I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Michael Calabrese. I'm here at New America with Mark in the Open Technology Institute. I direct our Wireless Future Project, which kind of focuses on spectrum reform and mobile broadband.
We've been advocating for that for a long time, whether when Peter talked about working towards must-carry or permanency, that those stations providing diversity of programming, local programming, whatever it may be, that it's a service to their market, to their community, but nobody has been willing to define what that is. And that's been the challenge.
That's not the criteria to allow the service to exist, and whoever, I don't care if it's a multitude of, weirdo voices, it doesn't matter. They're all, whoever has the license has the voice. There's no way to transition from a free market way that we have low power now to some idealized scenario of how we should be. There's no way to transition to that. We are what we are. We're a multitude of voices. The Hispanic voices are channels are there. The faith channels are distant network channels. You can't say they have to do anything local. How dare you? And the number one channel that needs to be secured beyond all of you is the civic channel. New York City now uses broadcast to get out the mayor's cable channel because people need to be able to use the bandwidth. TV is one to many. We need to preserve it wherever we can.
Really,
take 120 megahertz.
really appreciate that. Unfortunately, none of that's caught on because you don't have the microphone. But if you, how does low power television fit into what I think the incoming chairman of the FCC describes as a Rubik's Cube of considerations regarding what we do with spectrum?
Well,
how should it fit?
Michael, the musical chairs fear is the big fear, obviously, and what can we do about it? I'm very uncomfortable with content judgments. For example, even if you wanted to go so far as to say, well, the Chinese language programming in Washington is important because there's no other outlet for it, would you then look and see whether they repeat the same 4-hour slot 6 times a day, or whether they have 24 hours of different programming? What I think the Commission needs to look at, first of all, the Commission needs to decide it wants to find a solution. Once you get past that point, there are a number of things which might work or might help. Channel sharing is an obvious one, and I don't see any reason why the Commission shouldn't permit it. It's a business problem for low-power TV because if everybody else has five streams and you have only one, your economics are squeezed, but that's for individuals to decide. The second thing would be looking for a way to have low-power technology, TV technology, in spectrum that's not usable for other purposes. For example, if you used a distributed antenna system for low-power TV, and each distributed antenna had no more than 1,000 watts of power, you had 10 of them in a community, you are no longer more powerful than the wireless guys, and you can use the guard band. I understand the white spaces, people will go nuts over that, but the point is there are ways to avoid interference between television and wireless that might work for low-power TV and not for full-power TV. The alternative technology thing is a third idea, but just within the scope of traditional broadcasting, there are ways you could look to make this possibly work.
What about VHF? Would they fit well? Do they work well in VHF? Oh, I'm sorry. I was just asking, what about VHF, which is for, anybody who's not following, it would
Well,
be
I don't know how
like the
much
very
room-
low frequency channels.
Is there going to be room in VHF
The
when the
full
full
power
power guys
guys
all go down there? I don't know. Is it viable? I'll tell you a little more in a couple of weeks. Just today I made a must-carry demand on a cable system for a digital low-power TV on channel 2. And you can be sure they're going to tell me the signal is no good at the head end because it's full of noise. And let's see who wins, and then I'll tell you whether VHF works.
It's a great question, Michael. I built UHF and VHF, analog and digital low power. It'll work. It's suboptimal because of the power limitations at VHF. But more importantly, if I'm allocated a VHF channel and I have a UHF today, the thank you I get from the FCC for letting me survive in VHF is to go rebuild everything except the feed line. I have to throw out my antenna and my transmitter completely. There is no fund for me. I'm a small business person who has scrapped and struggled to serve my community. And incidentally, when you're talking about the First Amendment issues, I started as a home shopping guy, did well enough to bring the first Spanish language programming to the state of Oregon. If somebody had made a value judgment then about my home shopping, I never would have been able to be the guy who brought foreign language to the state. So you can't do that, but what I'm concerned with is even if it did work, I'm not sure I can afford to throw out everything I own because somebody said, move over there, little guy.
What about buying big antennas for all your viewers who can't use their little loop anymore?
Well, that's absolutely true as well. And people underestimate constantly the value or the cost of changing your identity. If I'm channel 16 and now I'm channel 3 or 2, there's a huge value. And in fact, I will tell you, during the Converter Box program, I begged the FCC to make the boxes automatically, once a month, rescan to find new channels, knowing this day was coming. They told me to pound sand. So now I've got to get everybody to go reprogram something they barely even know how to use. People need to apply some logic here. There are solutions, but the solutions can't be simply putting on blinders and ignoring the realities. Crushing small business out of existence because it doesn't have the ability to play in the big leagues is no way for anybody to take pride in keeping this country's communication diversity going.
I mean, back in the digital transition at these large community events, we got to the point where we were giving away analog pass-through converter boxes to make sure that our stations would continue to be seen. And when we talk about a value judgment, I in no way meant to imply that some stations are better or more valuable programming or whatever it may be. But what I do, working on behalf of my company and with the groups that we've worked with, I think all LPTV operators, they're innovative, they're small businesses, and they want, like I said, they want to be part of the solution. And whether they're, like Greg said, you know, they start with home shopping and expand into something else, or they're at a resort showing the weather, whatever it may be, I think everybody's willing in the LPTV industry to have the discussion, what can we do to save our stations and to remain competitive and continue to serve our communities, whether it's a religious community, whether it's tourists, whether it's Spanish language.
Now, Tara, have your stations made the transition to digital yet?
Yes.
Okay. So do you know where the rest of the low-power television community is in making the transition?
I have clients in both situations, but I would say that all of the stations that are serious local service providers felt they had to make the change, and they have made it.
And they're mandated to make the change by, what, September 2015?
Correct.
Yeah. And I'm assuming this is without any support or subsidy from the government
That's
to make
correct.
the transition.
I think the only stations left that you know have viable operations that I represent that are still analog are on cable, so that the over-the-air component is not as important for them.
Well, when we talk about the musical chair analogy, this is what's really difficult, is that we don't know what's going to happen, yet we have to invest in our stations and continue to move them forward. And like you said, in 3 to 5 years, are these LPTVs even going to be there? And that's really, again, a major, major business hurdle.
My name is David Wenbert. I have a digital media technology startup called Viburan Intervision, and we're looking at a lot of these issues from a little different standpoint. I wanted to ask, in the low-power television industry, how much interaction is there with the PEG cable station, public access cable arena, which is also a major community media resource, and also with full power TV for their sub-channel spectrum. As you know, the full power stations generally carry various secondary networks on their sub-channels, antenna TV, this TV. There's a whole bunch of them that generally air vintage television series that they license pretty cheaply. They fill it with commercials, and they offer that programming to the full power stations for free and split the revenue with them. And I don't see why some of the low power broadcasters couldn't simulcast their programming in partnership with full power on that same revenue sharing basis, and broaden the reach.
I think the concern that it wouldn't be a full partnership. I mean, I think you're going from owning your own station to then leasing space to have and I think that's, for many LPTV operators, that's just not an option.
Well, I'm not saying instead of LPTV. I'm saying that for content that they're already producing, where the sunk costs are already there to generate that content, it would seem to me that they could offer that programming to the sub-channels of full power in a way that both sides benefit. Because most of those sub-channels are now filled with really old, stale
How
TV.
does the full power station benefit by opening its doors to a competitor?
Because you split the ad revenue with them.
I'm not sure that's a good enough incentive. You realize that the diversion of some of the smaller networks that used to provide the economic foundation for low power stations and help them fund local programming, there's been a lot of damage as those networks have migrated to the .2s and .3s of the full powers, leaving the low powers without good national programming that they can use to support their operation.
I understand that, and part of what we're going to be doing is offering them new program streams. But where they are already generating original content, I think that the expanded audience would be desirable, and to the full power stations, it's going to be purely economic. Will I make more money splitting the revenue on this original programming than I do splitting the revenue on reruns of Hill Street Blues?
I'm not a broadcaster, so.
Well, I think there's some
Okay.
strong feelings in the back there.
Just really quickly, we're in competition with full power broadcasters. They're not going to gently take my news and stick it on their .2 to compete with their own. I mean, it's kind of an absurd premise. I mean, it's a nice in a beautiful, perfect world where we all just hug each other and say we're broadcasters, but this is a competitive environment. They're not going to give us anything. They're not going to pay us anything. And in fact, in the first 5 years of my life, I tried not to be destroyed by my full power brethren because they didn't respect me yet. Now they do, but they're not going to hand us anything.
And if you pay $1,000 to NAB and become an associate member, non-voting of course, your low power can be represented, and somewhere in the conversation they'll talk about it. Now, in their comments, in their FCC National NPRM comments, the cable companies, they want things done tidy. They want to cover their costs. They don't want to necessarily be unduly burdened by carrying new networks. But the full powers, they finally spoke about low power because they have a number of members that have low powers now. And that's the only low power and translators. There's 6,400 plus low powers and translators. We're over 74% of the marketplace. And yet we're getting hit with a double build of facilities during a 5 to 7 year period from the digital transition to the possible repack rebuilds. And it's going to cost our industry over $1 billion, on average $153,000 per station. So it is a lot of issues. And what you're talking about, carriage deals, other deals for content, you're a startup, come back in a year and talk to me how you've talked to everyone and what your experiences have been. The reason I'm doing what I'm doing as an activist right now for low power is my new national network that I was forming couldn't get the launch money because all my affiliates were low powers, and no one wanted to invest into my venture after I spent 18 months pulling it together. The PEG organizations you're talking about, that's a widely diverse group. You can't talk about them even in the same breath. They're all different. Every community is different. And they don't want their content over the air. There's very few of them that will even allow it to be over the air. I've been to hundreds of them. Some do. Some places in the country do have a good mix of broadcast. Like the state of Florida uses broadcast for its education channels rather than cable channels. So what are we going to do down there? There's all kinds of issues in the auction.
So please go ahead.
My name's Amy Brown, and I'm the executive director for an organization called SpectrumEvolution.org, and I'm going to kind of change the subject because I wanted to get this in.
And you used to be with the Community Broadcasters Association,
yes,
Amy Brown. Yes,
Yes, several years ago. But one of the things that has been talked about but not in depth is flexible use, and that's been brought up. Well, one thing our group is fighting for is if you're going to take the spectrum, let's find really good uses for it and give broadcasters a new business model. We were on the Hill, we fought hard, we got language added into the spectrum law that said, in exchange for relocation expenses, when your station gets moved to a new channel, if you choose to forego your relocation expenses, you may have flexible use of your spectrum. We got that language added in there. We're very excited about it, but our difficulty is now getting the FCC to define what flexible use is going to be. Now, my question to Peter and Tara, whoever wants to answer it, if there's anybody else who has insight, why would the FCC allow the auction winners, which we know are going to be AT&T and Verizon, immediate ability to do whatever they want to with that spectrum?
How can you know the auction winners now?
It's a hunch, I'm sorry. Just my impression. But why would the FCC allow them to immediately have any use of that spectrum that we had been stewards of for years and could provide in our community broadband services when us as broadcasters are able to do that now within a year, as Peter said, and then they're still even seeing the wisdom of it and giving future broadcasters who forego relocation expenses a similar opportunity, which they're still not defining. When I hear all this, and I'm just asking for opinions or ideas, What is the holdup? Is it competition? Do they not want multiple people providing multiple services? We can do that. It's a new business model when we know traditional over-the-air is not going to continue working for low power. Flexible use is there. Why are they not allowing us as broadcasters to provide that now in our market where we're on the ground and know what the needs are? Anybody have any insight on the panel?
What's your guess, Peter?
Well, the FCC has told me pretty much that they have a strong view that all television stations should be receivable on the same consumer television receivers. They say if the Advanced Television Systems Committee, ATSC, comes in, or NAB comes in, Dennis, and says, we would like to change the standard to this, they'll look at it right away. But they don't want the different stations to have a different standard. My answer to that, which I think has gotten through a little bit and they're thinking about it, is that we are almost completely finished with the uniform television receiver today. The cable boxes are different. The television receivers have USB ports and HDMI ports. The television receiver is a display device. You plug into it what you want. It is looking backwards to say that all the signals have to come out of TV stations with the same signal format. I hope that gets through.
I can't answer that, Amy. I mean, I don't have any. I mean, it's a conversation that, I mean, for us specifically, we're really concerned about remaining local broadcasters, but I think, you know, there's a lot of truth in what you say. Why not leave it with the local people who have been serving their communities for so long and allow them flexible ways?
Can I ask you, Tara, a very inside question? Is ZGS represented by the National Association of Broadcasters?
Some of our stations. We have had lots of conversations with the NAB, and it just recently for some of our stations have become members, but it was a very, very recent, and there was lots of conversations before that happened, is what I can say. And do you think as members they are fully represented by the NAB? The television stations or our company?
That NAB actually represents them, that they pull their political muscle for them.
For Class A and LPTVs?
Yeah. For your station.
I think they're beginning to take us into to listen to our concerns.
All right.
But fully representative, I don't think I would go that far.
Okay. Don't mean to put you too much on the spot. Thank you for that, and thank you, audience. I think we've gone the amount of time that we wanted to go into, and before I get myself into too much more trouble.
You get me into a lot of trouble.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.